All right, 1 Corinthians chapter 16. As we go through and we've looked throughout the book, I want you to note something. Just glance down at the text and you will note something that tells you where we are. And it is, he says, now concerning. He had not done this in chapter 15, which you recall I said indicated that it was intentional as an addition to all of what was the miraculous or those things that are outside that began in chapter 12. It was not dealing with the things that we go back to chapter 8 that was now concerning, that went all the way through chapter 11 about dealing with cultural influence. And then you go back to chapter 5 and it was now concerning that man who had taken his father's wife and dealing with that problem in chapters 5 and 6. That this laid out all these basic questions that the Corinthians had. And that he has developed them throughout, and you see that in the use of this term, now concerning. So as we come to this end, there's a reason why he places it at the end of the book, because it is going to naturally connect with Paul's travel plans. And the reason why that matters is in epistles in the first century, it was very ordinary, as a normal thing to do, to put travel plans in the end of section of a book or an epistle. You told people where you were going to go. Well, that matched up well with what he is talking about with the offering now, and so he was going to put it here. So that's the background. Now, we're about to read all four of the first four verses. I want you to listen, and I'm going to ask you to do something very difficult. It sounds easy, but it is difficult. I want you to, first, number one, set aside all your assumptions about these verses. Number two, I want you to see what simply is actually said. Number three, what is required because of what is said. And four, pay attention to what is not said. Because that will change your perspective on these verses, I believe. It's not going to, don't get worried, it's not going to shake up the world. It's not going to change all sorts of practice. That's not what I'm talking about. I'm talking about understanding the text as it is, rather than sometimes the assumptions that we make going into it. So let's go ahead and read now verses 1 through 4. Now concerning the collection for the saints, as I have given orders to the churches of Galatia, so you must do also. On the first day of the week, let each one of you lay something aside, storing up as he may prosper, that there be no collections when I come. And when I come, whomever you approve by your letters, I will send to bear your gift to Jerusalem. But if it is fitting that I go also, they will go with me. I think it's important, we usually only read the first two verses. I think it's important to read verse 3, verse 4, to make sure we pull the full context of what's happening rather than be dismissive of the situation. All right? So with those things in front of you now, I'm going to ask what's going to appear to be some basic questions, but they have a point. When was the Corinthian congregation established? Does anyone remember? Was it established in 55? That's when this book was written. But Corinth, when they first came to Corinth, it was earlier than that. Because remember in Acts chapter 18, he came there, that he had been in chapter 17, he had been through Thessalonica and established that congregation. This is you go the second missionary journey. You go through and you say that. He's over there. He comes down through Macedonia. We go to Philippi, which is where it ends in chapter 16. And then in chapter 17, immediately you've got this situation in Thessalonica. There is, as Norfleet mentioned, there was a lot of persecution that occurred during that time. Went on to Berea because of that, chapter 17 and verse 11. And then you find him then make his way down to Athens, where you find then the sermon in Athens. Well, in chapter 18, he next goes over to Corinth. So it's that same trip, same time period. So you're looking at around somewhere in the neighborhood probably of 51. Okay, AD. But we mentioned that this is after This time is after when he is over in Ephesus. Okay, so he's traveled on, and then you're on the third missionary journey. Now we're going back, and he's on his way back to seeing them the last time. So that's around 55 is when he is writing. So that's approximately, let's just say approximately 4 years. Brown's your math. Right? Okay? Accountants, got to double check. Okay, so now I want us to know, with that in mind, now concerning the collection for the saints, as I've given orders to the churches of Galatia, so you must do also. My first question is this: why did Paul wait 4 years to instruct them to take up a collection? I'll see myself out. Why was it necessary for him to make this particular requirement here, this command, if it's in 55 AD, but they were established in 51? Because they weren't doing it? Why weren't they doing it? Because it hadn't been commanded yet. So why does he command it now? Because a need had arisen. Okay, this is going to get down to a core point for us to recognize is the nature of the timing. Again, I said it's not going to change some huge thing, but it should change the way you think about it to recognize why would you go for 4 years? It wasn't required. And now the first thing I want you to think about is that means you can do all the work of the church and be the work of the church, do everything the church is supposed to be without money. Yes, but my point is why that was this specific thing. But it had to be commanded. But it's the only time, but that makes sure, before we say that, where else is any given commanded? Yes. So if you're looking for authority, this is the place to come on giving, correct? Now it's going to be followed up in 2 Corinthians, chapters 8 and 9, and there is as well recognition implied in Galatians chapter 6. Why? Because he's saying to be able to support the preacher, which he also, earlier in this book, 1 Corinthians 9, had mentioned. So there was some means in which people were giving, but not in this method and for this purpose. And what happens sometimes is that we don't work hard to try to figure out the first century context, how they did stuff, and then we impose on them the way we do things, instead of realizing that doesn't necessarily match up all the time. They had to be providing some because the Philippians were giving to Paul. Okay? So there was some method behind that. The Corinthians had done something. They were familiar with that chapter 9. But this itself is actually focused on something else. Now, all right, y'all still, I'm looking out and saying, okay, how many people have I already confused, irritated? Okay, stop making me think, okay. But also, the first thing you need to notice is the collection for the saints. This was a very specific collection. That's not going to change our practice because it is the model for us, which I will demonstrate. But it doesn't help us to ignore what the text says if we're going to be biblical. It's the collection for the saints. Well, that means that they had a context for it. They already knew what that was. It was a collection. That's no difference in the Greek word here, what that really means. Putting together from other parts, collection. But it was for the saints. David?
Do you think this is in relation to the Acts chapter 11 prophecy of the famine in the days of Claudius and the collection and stuff?
It is possible. It's hard to tell. I've never seen a really good source on that we can tell when the famine actually did occur. But you certainly see that, of course, you're right about the prophecy time in chapter 11. Time frame there of the prophecy would have been pretty earlier. It said it came about in the time of Claudius. Now, here's the only challenge to that. Claudius dies in 54, and this is 55. So that would tell me that that was a previous problem, though it could be that nature of that famine had created poverty in Judea that lingered. That could also be said. So we're right on the edge as far as the timeline goes. So is it possible? I think, but it would be at the edge of it. But what we do know is that Paul, and this is recorded in the book of Acts, had as a mission to go and to collect money, specifically to take to Judea for the Jews who were in distress in some way. And that this was part of what his third missionary journey was accomplishing. It was to get people prepared and then to go through and to collect it. Now, I would submit to you as a sideline, and this is more about bringing together the nature of a confluence of circumstances rather than a direct argument. What Paul was wanting to do on one hand was, this was going to be an opportunity to show Jews that the nature of the church and that Gentiles took care of Jews, and that they felt a kinship to them, and they expressed that in a large way. Everything you see during this time is Paul is going through this time period, he's being followed by Judaizing teachers who are creating problems for him, antagonism in the congregations where he goes. It happens in Corinth, in between the time that he gets news from Chloe and when he sends his next letter. They've had people interfere, which is what 2 Corinthians addresses. So you've got those things going on. Paul is trying to unite the church. And that is why, as you see him in going back toward this, it's why he was willing to take what was a cultural vow. It was why he was willing to go back even though he was told that he would face imprisonment. It was why he was willing to go in to the temple even with all these people mad at him. Paul was willing to do whatever he could to put together and to show that he was not anti-Jew, he was pro-Jesus. And that's what he was putting together. Okay. This was part of that effort. And so it serves a very specific purpose. It serves a direction of need, specifically, of giving money for the saints in Jerusalem that would be distributed. That's the financial need. He wanted, through that, it to be proof of the love that the church had throughout Gentile areas for their brethren back in Judea. So it shows us that when you give something, okay, here's sidelight. It shows that when you do give because someone has a need, it is an expression of love and should be understood in that way too. Whether it's from individuals giving to you or a congregation giving in that way for you, which is important. And there ought to serve as that interaction and connectivity which he wanted to bring, that no congregation needs to see themselves as an island, but to learn to be connected and the care. Okay? And he goes into that more in 2 Corinthians chapters 8 and 9. But the first thing is we got to set the circumstances correctly. Okay? It is for the saints, a specific thing, and that's what you see as you get to verse 3. The other part of this is when he says, as I have given orders to the churches, okay, congregations of Galatia, so you must do also. That's a command. That's a moral requirement. Necessity of doing this. Not an option. Okay, that's important. Not optional. You do this. But it's what he has done for the churches in Galatia. Now, what's interesting is that he would refer to Galatia, and I think they would say that that's the most recent. He is over here at Ephesus, and he's been sending out, we don't have this missive, that he would send out and require them to participate as well. Okay? So they're doing this. We know as well from 2 Corinthians that the Macedonians, we're thinking about Philippi and Thessalonica, they were participating in this. So this was a large-scale effort of all the congregations Paul had established. He was trying to get them to participate and commanding them to in this effort. So you do this. So that brings us to verse 2. So now we have, I'll see you, Paco, just a second. Now we have, in verse 2, he's going to talk about method. So we have the nature of it that they already knew about. Okay? But it was a specific idea for this, for the saints. It was required. All right? To help out. And now he's going to get to, here's how this is to be conducted. Okay. It is, no. It is, that's what we're going to take. The method is what we're going to see here in verse 2. But the need in this situation is actually what ultimately was a collection over time toward putting this all together, and then one time taking this in to give to the church in Judea. That part of it was one time. So it was a specific and a more limited kind of thing that we have to then apply in principle. Okay? So let's take a look and consider verse 2 on method and why the method. On the first day of the week, let each one of you lay something aside, storing up as he may prosper, that there be no collections when I come. Now, what I want you to note then is the first part of that was congregational, right? We saw in verse 1, it was congregationally oriented. Gave order to the congregations of Galatia, so also you, plural, do. But all of you who make up the congregation of the Corinthians, congregational. But within that, in order to make that work, there has to be individual contribution. I mean, it's pretty hard for a congregation to give any money if the individuals haven't given any money, right? I would hope to have gotten a little bit better response on that. Okay, I know it's obvious, play along. Okay. So first of all, on the first day of the week, okay, so he cites the day of when this is to take place. Now the question is for you, within the context of verse 2, why? Say it again? It's the Lord's Day, okay, but why? Because you're all coming together. You're all coming together to partake of the Lord's Supper, okay? Combining what you have in 1 Corinthians 11, which didn't say the day. Acts chapter 20 and verse 7 says the day, that it was in the assembly, is addressed there in 1 Corinthians 11 at church in the assembly. But so that's when you are all together. Now I want you to just think of it this in a we're going to first deal with it in a practical way. We'll do it some other ways too, but the way in which you were paid in the first century, right? How would you typically be paid in the first century, most people? What now? Cash? Coin? Yeah, it was bills, it was coins, right? So you had that, and you also, if you were a laborer, for instance, you were paid at the end of every day. You received, typically a coin, right? So you're collecting all those. So now, if you're going to create a collection, which is what is in verse 1 and in verse 2, in order to have a collection, at some point, these individual coins have to be put together where they are collected, right? How do you do that in the first century? Well, no, hold on. Don't use that term, take up a collection, because I don't see it here. I don't know. I'm going to be stickler on this. We're going to be biblical. No, it doesn't say offering either. Okay, I want us to understand how they did it rather than just and use the biblical language so that then we can get to how we do it. Okay, hold on, we're not there yet. Yes, as they prosper, but I want to get there in just a moment, okay? So hang on. The first part of it is on the first day of the week, they were there, so that's when they are assembled. It's hard to collect things when you're not with those people. Okay, that's the first very practical thing to understand. If you're going to do that, they couldn't have put it anywhere because somebody's going to be holding that. A lot of times it was going to be in someone's home, right? Someone's going to have in charge of that money, but it's going to be in a central location of where it all ends up. Okay. Okay, yes, but that's the individual responsibility. Okay? Okay, so now we're to the individual part. Okay, and this is let each one of you, okay? There's your individual part. So the you is everybody, but the each means we all have an individual responsibility, and that is to lay something aside. That is, now, at what part are you doing this? Now, the reason why I ask is this in reference to laying aside something when you're home and setting aside, or is this laying something aside when you come together and you're lay something aside for the collection? It's hard to tell in the text, isn't it? It's very hard to tell in the text. Okay, good. It's going to have to be put in a place. For it to be somebody else's, the church's collection and not your collection, it has to be simply moved over to the church's collection. All right? So I think that's what you have. And the reason why for that, though, is that there be no collections when I come. Okay? So the reason I say that there be no collections when I come is saying, here's why I want you to do this. That you are setting this aside so that it's already collected, so that there's not a need for a collection at the moment when I show up. That it's already collected. That's the point of all this. Okay, is he doesn't want them to wait around in order to contribute toward this. And this is actually very important because of the principles involved. And when you get to 2 Corinthians 8, you realize they seem to have a real problem with this. Anybody here? No, if you don't want to out yourself, that's okay. Anybody here a procrastinator? You like to put things off? Some of you are putting off raising up your hand. Okay. There you go. Okay, so we tend to put things off. So what he is addressing here is stewardship. Don't put things off, and it needs to be done in a systematic way. So that you're not caught off guard, and you're I want you to think through what he has just done. It is to be planned by the individual as well as the congregation in order to address need, and it is to be done regularly in anticipation of needs rather than, oh, we got a problem, everybody give. Okay, so the whole idea is that it's not where we're always having to scramble ad hoc just to cover an expense. Those are the principles he's addressing here, of that he is laying it out. Why do you do this? It's because of dealing with need, showing good stewardship, that everyone learn to prepare, use that, everyone contributes, and that can then be available when there is the need, rather than waiting around, spending all our money, and, oh, wait a minute, there's a need. Okay? All of these things are being addressed and are implied by the way he's addressing this particular text. Now, we want to make sure and get to that one point, though. He says, storing up as he may prosper. Storing up is a neat word. It's not that it's going to be just earth-shattering or anything. It's the word from which we get the word thesaurus. And I like to point that out because no one is going to know what a thesaurus is in a few years. It's an idea of a treasury. Okay? So when it says storing up, right there, that's treasuring. That's creating a treasury. That can be pretty important when you get into some little detailed doctrinal things. What are they doing? Individuals are setting aside money, they're making that determination, and then coming together for when they're on the first day of the week. That time is, I'm going to set this aside, and it's going to become part of the congregational treasury today. It's what I'm doing. Okay, it's part of my action. Now, you notice it does not provide a specific requirement of the means of which the transfer has to take place. It doesn't say how that is to take place. Now, and that's when you look at that, then you have then a general principle of requirement, and you're to do it on, this is regular basis, weekly, according to need. We'll discuss more of that in a minute. And that it is to be then, you're taking money and moving it over to the church treasury. Okay? How did they do that typically in the first century? We were almost there in a minute ago. What was their method? Well, they did it by hand, but where? But what did they do actually? There was a box, and kind of like we have, and they put it in the box. That's right. You go back when you go back to, you don't have an example as specifically, you do in archaeology, and you have an example at the temple, that this is how they collected the temple money. Is they had a big box and people put money in the box. This is why I want us to, we have to think about it the way they did it. That does not mean it's wrong to pass trays. It's just not required to pass trays. Because as long as you are fully doing everything that this verse says to do. All right? And this is what we have to make sure we're thinking about. The question is, are we doing everything the verse requires us to do? And if we are, and then there are multiple ways to do that, then that pleases the Lord. And so long as all the principles, all the methods required are given and followed according to the Scriptures. Okay, Paco. Well, now you asked me a direct question. Now my question for you is this. Is there somewhere you can show me where it is called an actual act of worship?
I'll be honest with you. I was going to ask you if this context does show that it is considered an act of worship. People claim that giving is one of the 5 acts of worship.
Yes. And that's why we have to put it in a biblical context. That grew out of the Restoration movement, no problem there. And it doesn't change anything you do. Question is do you know, okay, I'm going to broaden the question out for you. Can you tell me why anything we do is an act of worship? Or is that because you've got it on your 5 fingers and that's why? Because that means we need to do some background work if we don't appreciate what worship is. Do you realize that not one of the 5 things we do, specifically in assembly, is ever called worship in the New Testament? Okay, we're getting there, hang on. It's not called that, but that means we have to reason through of whether or not it is. But that means you have to understand what worship is. And then you have to say, here's what worship is, and then this fulfills what worship is. Okay? That's how you do this. Because it doesn't just say, and this is worship. You don't find that. Now, it's even more complicated than that. Thank you, Paco, for doing that to my class. I'm just joking. Because there's so many different Greek words that are translated worship in your New Testament, and most should not be. Okay? depending upon your translation of what they all are. Okay, the main one, what's found in John 4, verse 24, is proskuneo, that you always hear, is to kiss toward. Okay, that is most definitely always connecting in the Septuagint to the Old Testament forms of worship and what it says and what Jesus says in John 4, what worship is. That is, you have a direct action, okay, that is, in this case, it's also understood, it's commanded by God. It's not something I want to do. It's what God wants that is directed specifically to Him in order to honor Him in accordance with how He asks to be honored. Okay. Now, so then you're looking at what do you have as far as behaviors that accomplish that end. Okay. So, for example, in singing in prayer, you're singing to the Lord, right? Colossians 3, verse 16. Okay. You are to pray to deity. We won't get into the details on that. Okay. Pray to God. Okay? No question, that's worship. When you partake of the Lord's Supper, what are you doing? Well, what I heard was, you're remembering deity. What deity has done. Okay? Worship. Okay? What? Minds taken, directed specifically toward deity, in honor and recognition of what deity has done and what deity has said. Now, preaching and collection are much more difficult because you don't find those kind of statements about them. Okay? That doesn't mean don't do them. Don't anyone leave here saying that. Okay? But I'm just saying that the best, for example, the best you could say is when you have, we just covered 1 Corinthians 14, there is some distinction made in the assembly of what women can do and how they can speak up versus what they can do in what is not an assembly context, 1 Timothy chapter 2. We noted that correctly? Right? So if we note that does not on its own mean that it's worship, but it certainly is treated as being distinct from just any given regular study. Right? The question is that because it itself is a different kind of study, or the assembly itself, because of the context of what's there, is what makes it so? Well, that's another question. Then you get down to Paco's question on the nature of giving. Now, typically, when going over this, the thing you're looking at is giving being the equivalent of offering sacrifice under the Old Covenant. It's typically what I would think that would be the reference to, and therefore that was worship, therefore giving is worship. Here's the problem, is that the sacrifices they were making is more tied to what Jesus did than to what He asked us to do. Because they had free will offerings in that time too that were not considered the same as a sacrifice. So if you're looking for something that is equivalent in the Old Testament, the free will offerings would be the equivalent, rather than going and offered a sacrifice. So the problem there is we're reasoning through and whether or not we're connecting things that we've kind of made a parallel application, which is always the hard thing about making an application, is you have to keep them as parallel as possible, rather than assume. Now, you go through on that. Now, my question next on this is, okay, I'll jump ahead to this. How would that change? Okay, this is theoretical right now. How would that change your giving? It wouldn't? Now, he says it's as you prosper. No, that's the amount, right? So he's basically saying it's according to, and that is the standard against what you judge this is proportional. But that's not dealing with the worship question. Now you could go though to 2 Corinthians chapter 9, verse 7, right? If we turn over there, so let each one give as he purposes in his heart, not grudgingly or of necessity, for God loves a cheerful giver. Okay. Now, my next question on this is, when do you purpose in your heart? When you get what money in, that's when you make the decision? And then you make the decision. So the decision itself is already made before, it have to be made before you get to the assembly, correct? For most, I don't know, there may be some people up here that wait to the last minute and say, right? The Christian scribblers, that's what they are, okay? But it's before, and it's done individually, which therefore the purposing is not what's done in the assembly. So what is actually done in the assembly? The action of giving, does it say it needs to be in the assembly? It says it's on the first day of the week, but did it actually say in the text that it needed to be in the assembly? Okay, just checking. The gather, yes, but what the purpose, as each one of you is going to do that, when are you gathering? It's when you're gathering together, right? But where is that? Now, I want you to, this is why I said that in the first century, the common practice was to do so. You're coming in, you're on the first day of the week, you'd come in, you'd put the money in that box. Is that actually happening within an assembly? It would, be usually prior to the assembly, unless you forgot, you did it afterwards. Okay? But, which would be, it'd still be if you did that, you'd still be fulfilling what this says. Okay? And that's where I want us to think. Again, this is to avoid, I'm trying to make hard, and I'm actually trying to teach a lot of hermeneutics in the process of this. To make sure we do not end up binding things based upon just this is how we've always done it without understanding why we're doing it that way. So if you think I'm being hard-headed about this, I am. But not about the giving itself, because I don't think that that's really a problem. It's about how we need to understand it. John. Yes. And, now just so, that's right, of what to do with COVID. Now, I will say that I'm on record on all this before COVID. So this is not a reaction to COVID kind of situation. This is a reaction to God's word kind of situation. Okay, what do you do is, now that it plays out, but this is kind of what the benefit of trying to study is to see, okay, what is allowed when you have to, when push comes to shove in some situations, that there are what we call expedients. Well, that is that if there are multiple ways that are acceptable according to what the scriptures say, then you can choose and adapt to what the situation requires that is the best for that situation. Okay? But sometimes what we do is we take something that it's the best for the situation at hand, and then we say, and we do that, and we do it for so long, then we think that that's the only way to do it. And that's the thing we have to watch out against. Okay? JT. Okay, good. No, it does not. That's a great question. Does it require to give weekly or just weekly, or can you do it bi-monthly? That's where I think the as you've been prospered is important. That's according to that. Now, could you spread that out because you know what you're going to get? Yeah. No, but here's what I want you to remember. Not everyone always knows how much they're going to make. Okay. In the first century, they certainly didn't know. So they would not know until after the fact what it was they had to give. Now, they were storing up Monday, Tuesday, Wednesday, Thursday, Friday, Saturday. Okay? That's how they would do it, and then they'd know. Whereas ours is the opposite side of that. But so long as your giving is proportional to what you gave, at the time, had you fulfilled what this verse says to do? It goes back to the reason why is that why it's given on the first day of the week to do is because that's when everyone's together. So otherwise, you'd have to be able to anticipate your paycheck. That's not always possible. You could kind of work and say, well, I got this last time, and do that. That'll be a little bit harder. But that's why I think he gives that as you've been prospered, which is very different. Okay, to get the back, we're running out of time, but to understand the background of this, remember there were very specific things that were said, say, for in the Jews about what they had to give, but there were allowances dependent upon what their income level was, even with sacrifices, okay, where it was according to what they had, and that part is what's left here. What is required the same is what you give of you. And that requires all. Okay? Okay, I think I saw something, another hand. Star. Yes, it depends. Usually it wasn't that they would move around to different houses. Usually there was a benefactor, someone who was wealthier that had room, and that's where they usually met. And that is described in various places. It's not as specific, but sometimes they'll say those who meet in your home. Okay, look at, for example, go to Romans 16. There's a list of congregations that are giving, and that's what you're doing. So you'd have places in the home to meet. That actually addresses a lot of other problems as well. But what I want us to see, and I know we haven't resolved it, and I don't have time in 1 minute to resolve everything, but I want you thinking about, on a practical level, what we have, on a spiritual level, what we have, and all of it needs to be at a biblical level of what's said, of what we must do and what we should not bind beyond. And that's where I'm using this as an exercise. For those who don't like exercises, I'm sorry, but that's why I'm doing this, is to walk us through all these kind of things hermeneutically, just an interpretive process, so we can get a better handle on how you understand these things. And we'll pick up with that next week.